Thank you. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Angie Clark, and I am part of the marketing team here at Perficient. On behalf of our entire team, I'd like to thank you once again for joining our webinar. Before we move on to our presentation around planning your migration from Skype for Business to Microsoft Teams, I did want to review a few basic housekeeping items. First, all participants on this call are in listen-only mode, which means everyone is on mute. You can submit questions to the speakers anytime today by typing them in the chat window, which is located on the left side of your screen. Please make sure you state your questions clearly and keep in mind that other webinar participants cannot see your questions and vice versa. As such, your questions to the speakers will be anonymously addressed as time allows towards the end of the presentation. If you still have unanswered questions after the webinar or would like to request information about our services, please feel free to reach out to our speakers directly. You can also fill out the Contact Us forms located on our Perficient.com website. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you within the next few business days. A link to the slides will also be included. Now that we've covered a few webinar-related items, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. On the call with us is Trevor Miller. Trevor is a Microsoft Solutions Architect here at Perficient, focused on the Microsoft Unified Communications Stack. He has architected, led, and deployed solutions for various Link Server, Skype for Business Server, and Office 365 projects involving every facet of business and technical requirements for clients' UC needs. Joel Olson will also be leading our presentation today. Joel is a Microsoft MVP and a Perficient Regional Director. He drives strategy and evangelism on modern productivity, modern workplace, communication, portals, and collaboration for us here at Perficient. Joel, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Angie. Hey, it's great to be on here. I feel like this is such a relevant topic. It's actually one I've been kind of clamoring to talk about since the announcement back in July, actually. But before we get into it, I wanted to just give you a little bit about a little bit of information about Perficient. So Perficient is a leading digital transformation consulting firm. You probably heard a little bit of that from Angie, but essentially we're in 26 plus offices across the U.S. And so I want people to feel comfortable and know that we're nearby. In fact, I actually recently was in Denver and Chicago running some Teams events where we actually presented some of this content. And we've gathered feedback from the community. In addition, Perficient is actually a publicly traded organization. We've been in business for a long time and a great partner with Microsoft. And we have global delivery centers. Lots of repeat business as well. So the agenda for today is we want to dig into this Skype to Teams thing. But as well, we actually have some kind of tips and tricks, best practices from the field that Trevor's going to really dig into. And I'm really hoping that this can be something that's very valuable for those who are on the call. So let's kind of kick this off by just starting talking about Skype for Business to Teams. And the first thing to talk about is really this announcement that was made in July related to Skype for Business Online and some of Microsoft's direction. Essentially, Skype for Business Online is going to be retired in July 31st, 2021. Now, the small customers in online who are using Skype for Business, Microsoft has simply helped a lot of those companies already make their transition. But as well, there's a lot of companies who are either using on-premises Skype for Business server. You may be using older versions, or even the latest version, 2019, that came out last year. So there's really a variety of customers who are in a lot of different situations. But really what you'll find is some people are like, is Skype for Business dead? You know, there's a lot of kind of confusion. And I want to use this as an opportunity to make it clear that Skype for Business Online absolutely does have a date, and that is July 31st, 2021. And that date is when that service will be discontinued. Well, what about Skype for Business server? Yeah.
Apologies for the disruption, but we have some audio issues for quite a few folks on the line. Could we ask you to pause your presentation until we can confirm that we have resolved that issue?
Absolutely. Do we want to do some questions about this slide with everybody else who's waiting? I don't know if
you certainly could. I think we're having audio potentially and visual, so we may want to address our issues before we proceed.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, I do see a couple of hands raised. It would be helpful if everybody who is having audio issues were to raise their hand. That way we know how many people are affected by this. Okay. So while we're waiting, I can just kind of continue to articulate this slide. We won't move beyond this. But I do want to make sure it's absolutely clear that there is a difference between Skype for Business Online and its retirement date and the Skype for Business server, which just recently shipped in 2018, or at the end of 2018, which will be supported through 2024. And while Microsoft is encouraging organizations to move when they're ready, essentially, if you go out right now to Skype.com and navigate to the server product, you'll notice there's quite a few taglines related to Teams. But at the same time, there's a lot of encouragement and understanding that with Skype having recently shipped for on-premise, that there will be continued support through at least 2024, and that Microsoft hasn't declared anything beyond that, beyond that kind of stronger language, I would say. And I don't know if you want to jump in here, Trevor, on this particular topic while we're waiting here. I know you've had a lot of conversations both with Microsoft and with the product managers about this particular topic, and we don't want to make any customers nervous unnecessarily.
Yeah, agreed. It's definitely a point of kind of confusion and contention for a lot of customers. A lot of larger enterprises are still using Skype for Business server on premises, so they're not as widely impacted as some of the medium and smaller firms that are using Skype for Business Online. But the distinction is that we still have supportability for the on-premises version through 2024 through mainstream support, and then some extended support after that. We just don't know, is Skype for Business Server 2019 going to be the end, or is there going to be another stopgap offered after that before Microsoft really tries to get customers to begin consuming the cloud? So to be determined.
I've got
definitely a point of confusion.
I've got a good quote for you that may be helpful as well from Microsoft. It says, "We recognize the customers are using Skype for Business Server and may need to continue to use Skype for Business Server for some users or geographies due to their requirements. In these instances, we encourage organizations to adopt Teams along with Skype for Business Server to drive teamwork and collaboration. The latest version of Skype for Business Server 2019 released October 2018 with initial mainstream support planned through January 9th, 2024. So, and I think that aspect of the global aspect from, say, voice plans, and as well, even roadmap items. There continue to be roadmap items related to features that relate to Skype for Business.
Yep, agreed.
And Joel, I'd like to interject.
Yeah.
My apologies. We can proceed. I think we've addressed the audio issue for the majority of the folks on the line.
All right, fantastic. I think everybody online will appreciate that. So one of the things I'm a little excited about is just today I launched this infographic that essentially simplifies this concept. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in conversation and kind of explained the differences between Skype for Business, especially Skype for Business Online, and Teams, and how there's this iceberg analogy, and there's really all this new added functionality that Teams has that Skype doesn't. And from a feature parity perspective, I know that the roadmaps have continued to show feature parity. And it was back in 2018 that Microsoft kind of strongly said, "Hey, we've met feature parity," even though if you were to look at their roadmap on the voice plans and conference rooms, there were still some gaps. Microsoft, since 2018, has strongly been encouraging, especially the Skype for Business Online folks, to move to Teams. And those who have, often what's been happening is they've kind of missed what's under the water. And what I mean by that is, obviously there's that rich chat functionality and all sorts of new elements to that chat functionality, but the channels and the tabs and the storage, rich storage, where you can integrate it with not only SharePoint and OneDrive, but the Citrix and Box, Dropbox, G Drive, and being able to really use what storage your teams use, and the hundreds of applications, including ones that your enterprise can build, the connectors that can pull things into your feed, the Power Automate integration, the Power Apps integration, the search integration, and like even being able to use that search bar up top to be able to search Wikipedia as an example, with more Microsoft Search integration coming. And then not only bots, but your integration for being able to bring in additional bots with the SDK and with virtual agents. And really that's just scratching the surface. Really, Teams is an application platform. There's these coexistence modes, and I want to spend a ton of time on these, but and I know that Trevor's planning on spending some time on it. But the thing that I want to just kind of call out here, people who have used Islands mode have had issues, and I actually would discourage you from using Islands mode if you can find one of these other coexistence modes. And specifically, I'm kind of referring to Skype for Business with collaboration and meetings, or Skype for Business with Teams collaboration. Essentially what you'll find here in the last cell of this infographic is this encouragement to break it up into cohorts if you need to. For small, medium business, you may be able to get away with going direct to Teams. If you have more going on, that idea of leveraging one of those coexistence modes that I just mentioned in a two-step approach, or I think it should be kind of a minority perspective here, but those who feel like they really need to go through multiple gradual approaches to get to Teams, that's also acceptable, essentially starting with using Teams for collaboration and then using collaboration and Teams for collaboration and meetings prior to going to Teams only mode for especially those who are using the voice. And the last little thing I want to show you here before I have a quick poll for you. One of the major things, if I could just portray it, is again going back to the iceberg analogy. it's not just about one workload or another or one component or another. You really should be looking at Teams holistically. This is actually an adoption dashboard from Microsoft IT. They were analyzing their Champions program. They were analyzing their Art of Teamwork, which was essentially a training brown bag type of exercise where they wanted to see those who we've touched, are they influencing their teams? And what does our usage of Teams look like in contrast to our Skype for Business consumption? And that was a major initiative and effort inside of Microsoft. Absolutely, anybody who's doing Teams, this is not something where you're just flipping the lights on. It's full-on adoption mode. And here, what we want to do is we want to open the poll and find out, everybody who's on here, where are you in your migration to Teams? And we've got a number of different options for you to choose. Maybe you've been planning on doing it, but just haven't started yet. You may be in the middle of migration. Maybe you're actually in coexistence, but you didn't plan to do it. And there are those who are complete or just about complete. And that's where I would say, for those who are complete, make sure you choose that one because there's not one that says complete, which I do feel like kind of addresses that idea that, hey, there's all that stuff under the water, and Teams is an application platform. Quickly realize Teams deployment is never done. You may continue, you may be done with the voice deployment or meetings and so on, but you'll find that the Teams as an application platform is never done. So it looks like we have most of those who've responded. I would like to get a few more if we can. But all right. Thank you. All right. What are the results like? It looks like we have a lot who are on in the planning stage. So from a perspective of planning, you'll notice that that's absolutely what we're going to be talking about here from perspective of network and really being able to help you understand some tips and tricks from the field in relation to preparing for Teams. It's also impressive to note that that number that are in coexistence, but not essentially that wasn't by plan, which often ends up being kind of this island mode, but not by intention, and causes confusion, multiple clients, and users don't even know what's happening sometimes. It's like I've had people on Teams saying like, what's going on? Well, we need to choose one tool or the other, and it's like, well, there really is progression here, so let's make sure that's actually happening. And with that, I want to hand this over to Trevor, who's our resident expert, who's spending over a decade on this in the unified communication space with a variety of different technologies.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So to get into some of the planning aspects of Teams, like we talked about earlier, there's a lot of confusion around what Teams is and what is the art of possible, what is Teams really capable of. So in my discussions with customers, I've kind of coined this acronym, which stands for ICANN, and it stands for really 4 pieces of the puzzle that we tend to look at in a very heightened sense when we are in the midst of engagements with customers, just because we know these 4 elements ultimately impact the way you get to Teams, and whether that means that you're starting from scratch and maybe you're just beginning to use Teams and you don't use Skype for Business, or maybe that means you do use Skype for Business. Or maybe it includes something like you're migrating from Slack or another platform, and you're just trying to figure out, what is this thing that is Teams and what is possible. So the ICANN elements for Teams really boil down to these 4 pieces, and it boils down to me, for the group that I work in, infrastructure, and it boils down to coexistence, and how you manage adoption, and that includes organizational change management and adoption change management, and then the navigational aspects. And really that is the point A to point Z. What's the roadmap? How do we get there? What steps do we have to take, et cetera, et cetera. So diving into these a little bit more, to talk explicitly about infrastructure, we have to talk a little bit about the beast that is Teams, and Teams is really a sum of its parts. And that could be calling and meetings, it could be chat, it could be collaboration, and it could be file storage, and then some of the other pieces and parts and connectors. So when you begin to really look at the beast that is Teams, Microsoft has what's called the principles of Office 365 network connectivity, and they boil down to 4 separate aspects. And this is really more of a network-specific topic, but because you have to get your data to Microsoft and Microsoft has to return it back to you, the importance of these principles directly impact the usability of the solution and the quality of things like audio and video, or the speed of file transfers. So the principles of network connectivity boil down to these 4 main pieces, which are identify and differentiate Office 365 traffic. If you're not sending your traffic to Microsoft from a local ISP, and instead of backhauling it, you should be egressing locally. Avoid network hairpins, so that could include things like not using split tunnel VPN, or maybe using cloud-based VPN or proxy solutions. And then, if at all possible, bypass on-premises security. Typically, we have spent hours and hours and hours of time and years and years and years and lots of money and processes and procedures to secure the 4 golden walls that is our on-premises data centers. But in the software as a service world, all of that data moves outside of our organization. So a lot of the on-premises security becomes less effective as a result of that, and it, in some cases, can actually hinder the Office 365 solutions from working. So to talk a little bit more about the identify and differentiate, really what this boils down to is, from an administrator perspective, we tend to go to this web page that lists all the IP addresses and the URLs for Office 365 and apply some configuration for that on your enterprise networks. And Microsoft really wants customers to focus on 3 specific types of traffic that they classify, and they break it down into optimize, allow, and default. The optimized category is the bulk of what we consume from Office 365. It's things like OneDrive for Business, SharePoint, Teams, Exchange Online. These are the bulk of the items that we as an end user effectively connect to. It's the most latency and bandwidth sensitive, and it also contains all of the media traffic when you come to talk about Teams calling and Teams meetings. So that single case of traffic represents roughly about 20 different IP address spaces, and Microsoft really wants you to treat it with kid gloves. Don't do SSL break and expect. You should bypass HTTP proxies if you're using them. Don't do deep packet inspection with firewalls, etc. The allow category is things like teams.microsoft.com. If you like to use the web client, you can use the web client, and the allow category supports the other features and functionalities in the optimized category. Generally, the allow category is a bit more web friendly. It's usually port 443 for most functionality, but it's a bit less white glove requirement. And then the default is really Microsoft doesn't care. This may be third-party content delivery networks. It may be solutions that Microsoft simply doesn't own themselves. But at the end of the day, it's the least impacted traffic that's out there. And one of the things that Microsoft really, really talks about is they want you to get your traffic onto their network as quickly as possible. So Office 365 consists of 45 and growing data centers all across the globe. Depending upon where you are as a customer, you may be a US-based customer, maybe you are UK-based, maybe you're Asia-Pac-based. Wherever you've created your tenant, that's typically where your data resides. So your data at rest is in the 45 data centers, and then they have what are called service front doors, and those exist in 100 plus data centers and locations around the globe, which aim to bring Office 365 a little bit closer to the user. So the way that this works is Microsoft has these network points of presence all across the globe where they interconnect with ISPs like Verizon, AT&T, etc. And this Microsoft Global Network, it's the traffic signs on the information superhighway that gets you to the Microsoft network as fast as possible. And the benefit of that is Microsoft has some intelligent content and business logic that attempts to optimize your experience based off of where your data is and where you're connecting from. An example of this is if I am physically located in Los Angeles and my network traffic goes to the internet in Los Angeles, there's a very good chance that Microsoft is actually going to move my Exchange mailbox to the data centers on the West Coast because they know that's where I'm physically located. The opposite of that would be a bad idea, which would be, say I'm in LA, but my network traffic goes to the internet in New York. In that case, I'm going all the way across the country for effectively no reason and resulting in some performance penalties as a result of that. So end of the day, the Microsoft network, it's very large, it's vast. The black dots on your screen represent the data centers. The yellow dots represent the service front door locations. I'll talk a little bit about what that means in the next slide. And the black lines are effectively the private interconnects that Microsoft has all across the globe. So they really are stretching the network to get closer and closer to you to make the experience feel more like what it used to be when you had servers on premises and you had everything in your data center. So a quick note on what are called service front doors, and those are effectively application or protocol specific delivery endpoints that we, the clients, like Outlook and Outlook Mobile and Teams, etc., we actually connect to these service front doors. And depending upon what application you're using, the front door may have a different name. In the Skype for Business world, you'll typically see them called a transport relay. For Exchange Server, you'll see them called client access front ends. But the goal of the service front door is to optimize that user experience. And the service front door implementation has changed over time as the service has grown and as things have progressed from one version of the service to another. A very good example of this is with Exchange Server, they have changed the way that IP addresses are used. And instead of using unicast IP addresses, we now use something very technical called anycast IPs, which if you use Google DNS, it's the same ultimate topic and the same experience. But the bottom line is you want to get your traffic onto the network as soon as possible and get it onto the Microsoft network, because that not only guarantees you a better experience, but it also guarantees you better performance. So you may just say, well, okay, the too long didn't read version of this is just send your traffic locally, right? And my response would be, well, maybe. There are some exceptions to this. And some of the exceptions that we've run on with several customers is your local internet circuit the most performant? Microsoft has fairly strict requirements that customers need to meet in order to have an acceptable media quality experience. And there's really no way to tell ahead of time that experience is going to be good unless you test ahead of time. There are several third-party testing tools that are out there, and Microsoft even has a tool as well that allows you to quantitatively send audio calls to Microsoft, receive the traffic back, and then see what the performance is. And sometimes those media streams, it just doesn't work out, and it's not good. And it could be because you're not following the network principles, or maybe there are other issues at play. And sometimes those other issues could be maybe you're using wired versus wireless. Wireless is a really, really hard solution to make work reliably for things like voice over IP and video and application sharing. So sometimes there are extra steps you have to take to make wireless work right. Maybe you have two ISPs. Maybe, as an example, you're a customer in Kansas that has a DSL line and then Verizon or Sprint 4G LTE. I have actually seen a case where the Verizon cell service was actually more performant than the DSL. Or maybe you are a customer that you have very well entrenched and established data centers, and you have to backhaul that traffic because of whatever business obligations that you say you have. If that's the case, you have to begin treating that traffic with the same kind of quality of service and guarantees that you would any other telephony system like a Cisco or a Avaya, whatever the case may be. But at the end of the day, for customers that really are using this local internet circuit mentality, you have to start treating that internet circuit as if it is a MPLS circuit, a high-quality MPLS circuit to your software as a service solution that is Office 365. And that means you need quality of service to make sure that your media streams for calls and meetings have more priority than someone downloading or uploading a file from SharePoint Online or OneDrive for Business. Same thing with what are called throttling policies. This is a bit more technical in nature, but the bottom line is while the codecs that take our audio coming out of our mouths and translate them into digital bits and bytes that go on the wire, while the internet is great as a transport, you still need to protect that traffic to make sure that you don't end up with calls where people sound like robots. So at the end of the day, make sure you're treating your internet circuits, especially for Office 365 and any kind of other real-time media. Make sure you're treating it with kid gloves and applying the correct concepts to it. So what I want to show you is actually some media metrics that puts this the theory into practice. So this particular customer was a customer I worked with about 2 years ago, where they were just beginning their journey from an Avaya PBX, and they were actually going to Skype for Business Online. They're now in the process of going to Teams Online. But effectively the same scenario where they were very security conscious, and they had several of the network connectivity principles that they absolutely were not adhering by. So to give you a little visual, this particular customer is referenced, their physical location is the red dot. They were located in northern New Jersey. And if you actually did some research, the green dot in New York is where the physically closest Microsoft network node was. This particular customer, though, was actually backhauling their traffic all the way back to Washington, D.C., and then by way of some sleuthing, we discovered that the ISP was then sending the traffic back to New York. So the traffic was ping-ponging back and forth, and as a result, there were some quality problems. People couldn't stay connected to calls. Calls would drop. Calls wouldn't establish at all. Screen share was really, really slow, or you would see it get kind of pixelated and fuzzy all the time. So this was one of the first things that we started to clue in on. And when we began to look at the actual metrics that came out of the Microsoft testing tool, things did not look good. This particular graph is something that we do for our customers as a part of our network engagements, where we take those metrics and do a little bit more analysis on it. And you can see it's basically just a pivot chart, but we're looking at the actual latency between the client, which was in their office, and the Microsoft testing node. And you can see there are several large, very large increases in peaks on this, which ultimately caused some issues for some of their real-time media calls in the locations. Just as a frame of reference, Microsoft's metrics say that you should be no higher than 100 milliseconds. They were well over 210, and in most business hours of the day, and especially peak business hours, they were definitely over 90, 100, 105. Jitter is another metric that the tool measures, and that's the difference between the arrival of packets. So packet 1 arrives, then packet 2, then packet 3, and it's the delta between each of those arrivals. Microsoft wants you to maintain less than 30 milliseconds of jitter, and you can see here right at 4 p.m. It actually peaked to about 750. Likewise, we had well over 100 during certain business hours of the day. So one of the things that we really worked on with this customer was getting those network configurations appropriate, working on getting local network egress, getting QoS in place to protect traffic. And as a result of that, we began to actually see some improvements. And you can see this is a graph that we took on another testing window after we got through some of those improvements, where the peaks were reduced by half. Round trip time never went over 50. Jitter was never over 14. There was a substantial reduction, and as a result of that, a lot of their problems started to go away. And one of the ways that we measure the success of those problems is through a Microsoft tool called the Call Quality Dashboard. Every customer that uses Teams gets this automatically by default. All you have to do is do some configuration on it to make the data sort of tell a story and speak to you. But at the end of the day, the tool is there, and you simply have to look at it and see what's going on. So the bars that you see here simply represent the individual number of audio streams that this particular customer was accumulating on a monthly basis. And the yellow dotted line is the failure percentage of particular calls, either call setup failures, which means you tried to get into the call and it never worked, or the next slide will show mid-call failures, which the call established, but then it failed. The call drops off. So bottom line, the higher that yellow bar, the worse things are. And you can actually see these first 3 to 5 months was when they were working through some of these issues, and things were really, really bad. Once we got some of those things fixed, you can see the actual number of streams, it increases by like 7 times, almost all the way up to 20,000 streams. And the percentage of failed calls dropped to about 0.5%, just less than 0.5%, which is great. Microsoft really wants customers to stay below the 1% line. That's kind of the benchmark. And likewise, this is the poor call percentage. So again, we're at 0.557%, which is great for the amount of calls that they have. So at the end of the day, these simple, what I'll call simple, air quotes, these simple changes really do make a huge impact, because it does definitely play into the experience that we as end users see and the happiness that people are going to have with that particular solution. Continuing on through the ICANN elements, you've got coexistence. So this is really going to be more geared towards customers that are still using Skype for Business today. And it largely boils down into 3 different topics of categories that I'll run through. When you're moving from Skype for Business, whether that's online or on-prem, to Teams Online. And they boil down to feature and capability differences. So we know, not everything is equal. And then what happens with the devices that we're using, and what happens with the end user experience and support and the adoption of the tools. So some of the feature and capability differences, Joel alluded to this earlier, where he was talking about the coexistence mode, which if you look in the documentation is called the upgrade mode. And it is a setting that you set in the Teams Admin Center that configures how the Teams client and the Skype for Business client operate together or apart. You are in island mode by default, which is great because you can pretty much use the features in both clients to the utmost extent. But it introduces significant complexity and usability issues downstream. So Joel and I will agree on this. I generally do not advise customers to stay in island mode unless you've got a real plan to move quickly. I'll discuss some of the topics, the reasons why in a bit. One of the features that I definitely appreciated with Skype for Business was you had this technology called Better Together over Ethernet. And it was a way to make your desktop, the Skype for Business client on your desktop, control a IP phone that may sit on your desk. So if you click to call somebody, the phone goes off hook. If you want to mute or if you want to put a call on hold, you can do so. All of the existing phones that are certified for Skype for Business are grandfathered into this supportability for Microsoft Teams, but one of the big losses is that Better Together over Ethernet does not function any longer as a result of that, unfortunately. There is a roadmap item to make this work, but Microsoft is really looking at changing how that is going to function and actually use Better Together over Bluetooth, which may introduce some unique considerations for customers that are using things like virtual desktop for call centers. So that may be a tricky little thing you have to work through, but definitely something to look out for. For customers that are used to dialing, say, 4-digit dialing, or need to be able to inter-site dial, maybe you dial 7, a site code, and then an extension. That all boils down to what are defined as dial plan capabilities. The numbers you dial, how it ultimately impacts and changes the number. In Teams Online, you're limited to about 25 rules. And where this sometimes comes into a problem is for customers, especially on-premises customers that have these large, complex, multi-site dialing configurations where you could reach any site on the globe by dialing. You may run into an issue where you have to force users into click to dial as opposed to extension site code dialing. So something to look at, a chance to simplify, but it does ultimately alter the user experience. And lastly, one of the other big feature and capability differences is around enhanced 911. There are a couple new laws, especially for United States folks that are on the call. Ray-Baum's law is one, and Kerry's law is another, that change the way that enhanced 911 is regulated nationwide. And that will ultimately come down into some capabilities in the Teams products with a feature called direct routing, where you use or tie into a phone system on premises through a session border controller. But the shorter story rather, is that it will likely require some additional alterations to what your existing emergency plans are, things around alerting, how the call should be alerted, who should get alerted, do you need to subscribe to an enhanced 911 service, etc. Those are all questions that you'll likely have to answer as a result of some of these new 911 laws, even if you're in a state that does not natively have state 911 laws. For device support and usability, again, coexistence mode, when you're in islands mode, it introduces some rather infuriating end-user results with things like USB headsets. And this is something that I have actually experienced myself, where it doesn't matter if it's a Jabra headset or a Plantronics headset. It doesn't even matter if the headset is certified for Teams or certified for Skype for Business. But when you're in islands mode, each application wants to try and control the headset. So what I have experienced is with my Jabra headset, I can't use the mute button on the headset. I can use the answer end button if both Skype for Business and Teams are running simultaneously. And conversely, with Plantronics, I can use the mute button, or I can't use the mute button, but can use the answer end button. So there's some really unexpected device behavior that comes out as a result of the coexistence mode being set into islands mode. And this is also true when you are in Teams only mode as well for users that are running very old versions of Skype for Business. But the bottom line is, again, coexistence mode can help sway some of this if you choose one of the interim ones, and then Skype for Business doesn't try and always control your audio device, and likewise for Teams. Again, for 3-pip phones, those are the legacy Skype for Business phones. There is some limited functionality involved in keeping those phones. Some of the features there I won't go into deep conversation about, but just know that You'll have to replace those phones before July 2023 if you're a Skype for Business Online customer. If you're a Skype for Business On-Prem customer, the July 23 date doesn't really matter. You can keep using them as long as you get updates from Plantronics, or not Plantronics, Poly or AudioCodes. But chances are you're going to want to replace those phones with a Teams native phone to fill in the gaps of some of those missing features. And then for customers that have conference rooms, you may have to require third-party implementation solutions, like if you've got Cisco or Tandberg or Polycom or LiveSize. There is a very high likelihood that you will require some additional components to make all of those disparate devices connect and be able to communicate with one another. And then on the adoption side, it's hard to deny that the workforce as it exists today is very diverse. I myself am right in the ripe old age of 35, and we've got folks that are probably 20, 30 years beyond me and 10, 15 years below. So we're very diverse and mobile and global and way more collaborative before. So as a result of that, the Skype for Business mentality just kind of, it doesn't necessarily usher in some of those changing workplaces as a result of that. So some of the guiding principles that we really look at when it comes to adoption is really keeping end user focus. What's the impact to the end user? Is it positive or negative in the overall result of this? And how does it alter their workflows? Tool consolidation. If you're an organization that has 5 different audio conferencing or web conferencing providers, I can pretty much guarantee your users don't want to use 5. They want to use 1. So if there's the capability to consolidate, simplicity is always better. More is not. And then looking at thorough planning. Key decisions and looking at validations around things like governance and things of that nature. Knowing some of the other pieces and parts around devices or security or some of the other facets of Teams helps you define what that plan should be, and then you simply execute that plan as a result of it because you've already got everything laid out. So some of the end user supports, and I saw some of the chats come in. The Outlook plugins, when you're in Islands mode, it is absolutely normal for you to see both the Skype for Business meeting button and the Teams meeting button. That is by design. It ultimately results in end user confusion because I don't know which one to use where. But again, the coexistence mode, if you configure it, it helps alleviate some of that. Additionally, your IM and present states become a bit out of sync as a result because each app is effectively independent. I don't send an instant message from Teams to somebody on Skype for Business in Islands mode. You can, but again, it has to be configured that way. And then for device support, so things like better together over Ethernet, or if you have an executive that likes to have a sidecar with all of the people, all of their extensions listed, how does the coexistence mode and the overall usability of the devices factor into your adoption plan? And if you have to make a sacrifice, how long will user sentiment last? And lastly, adoption versus optimization. Usability training is key. It's important. Don't skimp on it. But the ability for an end user to figure out how something makes my life easier actually makes them happier using the tool as opposed to feeling like something is being pushed down on them. So using Teams and all the collaboration features and some of the those particular knobs and widgets can actually change the way that users work. So it's not just a one-for-one replacement of Skype for Business, but you really are looking at trying to alter the way that workflows work and create some more process automation for end users as a result. And at the end of the day, when you've really looked at all that, it comes down to navigation. So determining what the path is going to Teams, how many stops are required. Is there a need for multiple coexistence modes? Do you have to do things like multiple offices separately, or can you do a large-scale, kind of big bang approach? All of that is typically, if you do the planning right, you have that roadmap figured out. You know where you need to start, you know where you need to go, and you have a well-defined path in the midst of it all. Rarely does one size fits all. That's why Joel has this great infographic. But it definitely is something that helps you in the long run. And there are some roadmap determinators. I won't go through all of these, but prerequisite planning is a good one. If you don't have your mailboxes in Exchange Online, there are some downstream ramifications as a result of your migration and your adoption of Teams. Or if you need certain security features as a part of the Office 365 stack, and maybe you don't have licensing for it, that reduces the capability in some of the adoption challenges as a result of that. So again, I won't belabor all of these, but just know that key decisions ultimately impact your planning roadmap, and if you do it right, there should be very, very few, if any, surprises at the end of that road. So just a couple key suggestions that I'll throw out here, and then I'm going to hand it back over to Joel. Teams is not a one-to-one replacement for Skype for Business. Yes, it does replace most features, but it is a new tool, and it is a new tool that requires technical change and personnel change. It's not just collaboration. It's not just meetings. It's not voice. It is a product that is a sum of its parts, and it's easy to get confused. So by all means, seek out expertise from Microsoft, whether that's your CSMs, or you get involved with partners, or the community, such as the Teams user group or the SharePoint user group, for information around the capabilities and frameworks to help make sense of the madness. And lastly, don't skimp on user adoption. Always include that in your planning, and the framework that you use should always be iterative, because as you progress in that process, you're going to learn things, and you should factor in those changes as a result of the pieces you've learned to improve along the way. So that's my core pieces there. So as a result, I'm going to hand over the rest to Joel and let him finish out.
Hey, thanks, Trevor. And with this wrap up, I'm going to fly through this, but I want you guys to start putting in your questions. I've consciously decided that I'm going to stick around a little bit after for Q&A, but these next few slides, we should be done by the top of the hour. So anybody who's got to go can go, but we will have absolutely use the Q&A panel so you'll be ready. So this first thing is Teams Advisor. Highly recommend using Teams Advisor. You may not see it in your tenant. It is in preview. But those who do see it, this gives you plans, essentially. Built-in plans, graphs, charts, who can help you, encourage you to do the right things. So that's, if you look in your admin UI in Teams, it's under planning. And there's actually two sets of plans, one for what I would call phase 1 and phase 2. And I don't want to dig into all that, but essentially you'll notice there's two sets of plans in there. Really cool stuff. Very worthwhile. Now, hey, we are a services company. Perficient actually does this for a living. So if you guys need any help on anything, we're happy to engage. Microsoft actually has money that they've set aside for partners to help customers, and we are happy to help see if any of that is available. But feel free to reach out. There are a number of resources here. Those who registered will have access to this deck and recording. So there's a number of resources here that I won't necessarily go into. There's an essentials guide to end user engagement, as well as adoption change management. There's a blog series on Teams, as well as some of our case studies. And our final poll, do you plan to use a partner or consultant in your migration to Teams? No, we plan to do it ourselves. Yes, we're working with a partner, thanks. Yes, I'd like to learn more. I'm not sure yet. So with that, the next up after we finish this is going to be questions, or it's going to be the Q&A. So we'd like to get this in there. I really appreciate everybody who has joined us on this. It really means a lot. But thanks for joining us again. And if you can, it'd be great if you could still respond to the poll. We'll stick here for a second. But I'm not surprised that there's a lot of people who are planning to do it themselves. I think that if you were to break it down and say, what would a partner do for me? You know, is it them pushing a button? And I think that what you saw with what Trevor was doing is a lot of it's breaking down the network. You know, and there's kind of from a voice aspect. You know, there's a lot who really are vested from a voice perspective or a meeting perspective, and what are you going to do with conference rooms? But as well, there's that whole use adoption change management side of it, as well as training, brown bags, you know, helping executives understand it, and all that stuff that's kind of under the waterline as it relates to channels and as an application platform. I think there's things you could do with that pilot group that would really help out even IT being able to kind of understand the vision and what's possible with the platform by solving essential business platforms with this and being able to build some real cool case studies. So let's it'd be great, Angie, if you wanted to read some of the questions out to Trevor and I.
I actually answered I answered a couple of them directly, but two questions. Anthony had one in there talking about there are add-ons for both Skype for Business and Teams in Outlook, and having experienced some issues with both of them work together, wanting to know if we had seen this behavior in the spirit of coexistence. Usually that particular issue is an artifact of being in islands mode, because typically anything other than islands mode would hide one of those, and therefore you only schedule meetings in one of the clients, not having the capability of both. So usually it's a result of being in islands mode. So that one is not surprising. And then Shrikant had a question around the Dubai government had blocked Skype for Business. Does this stand true for Teams as well? And it is true that there are some governments, especially in the Middle East and some in APAC, that have some regulations around some of the telephony aspects for software as a service products. Teams improves on Skype for Business fairly substantially in that regard, and as a result, some of those regulations like the TRAI in India become viable with Teams where they were not viable with Skype for Business before. So you should see better supportability with Teams where you didn't with Skype.
And it looks like that does complete some of the questions that we have seen. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up for us. I do want to thank everyone for once again joining the webinar today, and our apologies for any technical issues that you may have experienced. As we've previously indicated though, we will send out a recording of the presentation along with the slides within the next few business days. So thank you once again everyone for joining, and this concludes our call.